Welcome to the Performance Around the Clock podcast. I am Professor Satchin Panda, a scientist in the field of circadian rhythm. In this podcast, I will talk to experts in many different fields about science, health, and human performance. You'll also find out why circadian rhythms is my favorite topic. I hope you enjoy the podcast and thank you for listening. Welcome to another episode of Performance Around the Clock. I'm super excited to have Professor Mike McCarthy from University of California, San Diego and BA San Diego with me. Mike, as we fondly call him, is a really mid-career rising star in the area, in the intersection of circadian rhythm and psychiatry. He has an MD PhD degree, and I always say that the secret sauce of US biomedical research lies in MD PhDs like you, because you bridge the basic and translational science together. And Mike has been a professor at UCSD psychiatry and is also a staff psychiatrist at BA San Diego healthcare system. Welcome, Mike.
Oh, thank you, Satchin. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so I am always curious about people who have MD PhD. How did they get into it? Like, was there any specific incident, specific event, or were you inspired by somebody? How did you get into MD PhD, and also why psychiatry?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think a lot of people have a path that's not necessarily a direct path. And my path was a little bit circuitous as well, too. Mm-hmm. I actually started off thinking I was going to be an English major. Wow. And as I read literature and read about interesting characters, I wanted to know more about what they were thinking and what motivated them. And it got me into psychology. And I did my undergraduate degree in psychology at the University of New Mexico.
Yeah.
But even as I was getting through the end of my undergraduate degree, I was starting to want to know more about the mechanisms, the biological mechanisms of how the brain actually makes us think and behave and act the way that we do. And so I moved more into the biological psychiatry side of things, biological psychology side of things. And I did an undergraduate research project in learning and memory, mouse models of learning and memory, reading about the hippocampus and throwing mice into mazes and making them swim in milky water so they could find the hidden maze. And that was really fascinating to me. And I came from a family where my dad was a physician. He was a gastroenterologist. Yeah. And so I had that example of he was a very academically minded gastroenterologist as well too. So I had this idea from the very beginning that you could bridge clinical work and science in an interesting way. And I started thinking about ways that I could do that in studying the brain. Yeah. And that led me to read a lot of books around like Oliver Sacks and the man who mistook his wife for a hat. That was such an eye-opening book for me. It's such an interesting book. That was one of the things that got me interested in kind of a clinical neuroscience type career. And for the longest time, I thought I was going to be a neurologist. Yeah. I did my PhD in animal models of nicotine addiction, which was maybe kind of bridging into psychiatry. Yeah. And I started to think about how the brain is involved in motivated behaviors and reward types behaviors and what makes people seek out something even though it might be bad for them. It might be.
I guess your PhD thesis was on endorphin or something.
That's right. In the opioid system, how nicotine actually stimulates the opioid system in the brain. And so
opioid is the reward.
This is the natural reward system. And so what we found in that work is that nicotine stimulates opioids as part of its reinforcing or addictive potential. But more importantly, when you go into nicotine withdrawal, the opioid system kind of flips into this other state where there's another opioid called dynorphin, which is an anti-opioid. It causes dysphoria and mood to be dropped. And so nicotine withdrawal stimulates this dynorphin anti-opioid response as well too. So that was something that I did as my in my graduate school training. And around that time, I was inspired by the work of people like Eric Nestler, who he was a psychiatrist, but he did this animal work where you could model something in a mouse that you could then track the identical kind of behavior into the human,
Yeah.
and have these really exquisitely detailed molecular mechanisms of how something works at the subcellular, molecular, or genetic level that explains a behavior that you can see in a human patient. And so that was kind of the first time that I really realized that you could use neuroscience to study something like psychiatry as well too, which always seemed a little bit more amorphous or a little bit more vague.
Yeah, so a lot of people, they think that psychiatric diseases are due to stress and other environmental factors. And going back to cells and molecules and finding mechanisms is something really exciting, because that's when you can figure out the mechanism, how to find drugs, how to treat them, or even how lifestyle factors that improve health of psychiatric patients, how those lifestyle factors work on molecules and cells. Opens up, right?
Yeah, that's right. Like when I was in my undergraduate psychology course, a lot of the explanations for depression or anxiety have entirely psychological explanations for them. About it's a poor response to stress, or a developmental problem from having bad family relationships, or these kinds of things. And for sure, those things are important. But those things have to translate into something that's happening in the brain.
Yeah.
And how that environmental experience or those relationship issues or something actually come into something that affects the way that your brain is working was really a black box for a long time. And we're still in some ways struggling to understand some of that. But I think the time that I've been in training in my early career has really been such an explosion in understanding of what's going on. It's been really an exciting time to be a psychiatrist. And when I was in my MD PhD program in medical school, people would say, "You want to be a psychiatrist?" MD PhDs don't go into psychiatry; they go into cancer or pathology,
Exactly.
or neurosurgery or something like that if you want to study the brain. But psychiatry, and now I think it's becoming a much more acceptable and mainstream career choice to be an MD PhD psychiatrist.
Mike, can I ask you a dumb question?
There are no dumb questions, Satchin.
What is the difference between neurology and psychiatry?
Oh, I thought you were going to ask me the difference between psychiatry and psychology. So
that's the next one.
I can answer both of those things. So basically, neurology is the study of visible manifestations of brain function as it relates mostly to things like motor behavior or perception. So things like if you've suffered a stroke and you suffer paralysis on one side of your body, and you can no longer move that side of your body, or you can no longer feel on that side of your body, those kinds of problems would normally be managed by a neurologist.
I see.
Other things like seizures, or sometimes epilepsy, Alzheimer's disease will often go to a neurologist as well too. The psychiatrist handles more the behavioral type issues, or the kind of invisible kind of problems of brain function. So if somebody is suffering anxiety or depression or hallucinations, there may not be any outward manifestation of those problems that an observer can see, but that those problems are nonetheless very important and can cause somebody to be disabled and unable to function in their job or their career. And so a psychiatrist would manage those kinds of more kind of cognitive, or I like to say higher order brain functions, because these are really the things that are distinguish us from other animals that can move and see and feel, but they don't necessarily contemplate their meaning in life, or have a framework of where they are in the universe, or these kinds of things, these bigger order questions.
Yeah. No, that's it was always in my mind. Okay, so what's the difference between neurologists and psychiatrists? And thank you for clearing that. And then you brought up these issues that a psychiatrist like you often deal with patients who have depression, bipolar, anxiety, and maybe schizophrenia, and all these issues. What fraction of the population, at least once in their lifetime, go through this kind of issues? I know that everybody who goes through a period of bereavement, of course, all of us will go through a period of bereavement.
Yeah.
And that will cause a period of feeling depressed, low, all that stuff. So if we exclude that period of bereavement, what percentage of people actually go through at least one episode of clinically defined psychiatric conditions.
Yeah, well, maybe before I give you the number, I'll define a little bit about what distinguishes a psychiatric disorder or a mental health disorder from just a normal experience to a stressful life event. So as you said, almost everybody has some experience in their life where they've suffered a disappointment or a loss or a worry or some kind of negative emotional state. And that's very normal. That's why we have emotions as human beings, is because we have to motivate ourselves to change our circumstances in relation to what's going on around us. When that response becomes disproportionate and out of proportion to the stimulus, or lasts longer than you would expect, then you start thinking about a psychiatric disorder. So for example, I'll use the definition of depression as an example. So when we diagnose somebody with depression, we ask, have you had a whole series of symptoms, more often than not for at least 2 weeks in a row? And then once we ascertain that those symptoms are severe enough and persistent enough that they've been lasting for 2 weeks, then we ask the question, is this causing some kind of impairment in your life? Is this causing you to have a problem with your family, or a problem at work, or a problem at school? And if the symptom duration and severity is long enough and there's a disability involved, then we say there's a psychiatric disorder. But you really need all of those other things in place. So that would rule out things like bereavement, or hearing bad news, or these kinds of things that are more normal experiences. And when you apply these criteria and kind of start to be a little bit more selective about how often does somebody experience a mental health problem, it's actually remarkably common. It's somewhere around 1 in 5 of everybody in the world will have a mental health problem. It's at least some part, a mental health diagnosis, not just an issue, but something diagnosable at some point in their life. And the most common ones are things like major depressive disorder or anxiety disorders. But there are a wide range of other kinds of things. Substance abuse disorders are very common. Smoking is a psychiatric disorder. Alcoholism is a psychiatric disorder. People can get hooked onto pain medications and things like that. That's considered a psychiatric disorder. So a lot of the things that we hear about in our lives that are problems, like the opioid epidemic, or smoking, or perhaps even obesity, you could categorize some forms of obesity as psychiatric disorders as well too.
Oh, I see. So then I think it may be 4 out of 5 adults who may go through at least.
Oh, I think I got that. I flipped it the other way around.
Because if we think about it, a lot of people go through that period of impairment to their peak emotional and intellectual performance. Because, these psychiatric disorders are essentially preventing us from achieving or sustaining our optimum or peak intellectual and emotional performance. That's the way I look at it.
That's a very good way of putting it.
That way, the person also understands that he or she could do even much better emotionally or intellectually, but due to the presence of the psychiatric or some conditions, whether it's craving, just like you said, certain forms of obesity, maybe for excessive food cravings, and drug withdrawal and other stuff. So that's pretty large number of people who go through at least one episode in their lifetime. It's at any given time. It's not that 4 out of 5 people are going through it, but at least once in their lifetime.
That's right.
That's pretty large number too, right? And it's also, there is a lot of societal stigma sometimes that is associated with it. So that's why people don't seek out help for psychiatric disease or conditions. So that's also another issue. So, but what really distinguishes you from many other psychiatrists is your curiosity about sleep and circadian rhythm and how it contributes to psychiatric conditions. So how did you get into the sleep and circadian aspect?
I came into it definitely from a psychiatry first standpoint. Some people are born chronobiologists, and then they find some way to apply their chronobiological knowledge to a clinical problem. I came into it clinical first, and I came into psychiatry. I told you I was interested in addiction as a graduate student, and I realized kind of that addiction medicine wasn't for me. I think for various reasons, I really gravitated towards the mood disorder patients. In some ways, because there's some overlap between bipolar disorder and addictive disorders, in the sense that the reward system becomes dysregulated. So in in addictive disorders, substances take on an excessive amount of rewarding value for people, and they spend all of their attention seeking out substances. Whereas in bipolar disorder, mania is this idea of hyperarousal, euphoric mood, energy, and sleeplessness that's kind of unprovoked by any apparent stimuli. And it's the same neurobiological systems, but it seems to be happening spontaneously. And when people get into these states, they develop grandiose ideations that they have special powers. They might think that they have abilities like a god or like a famous person or a celebrity. They might think that they have some insight into the ways that the world is working, or a religious enlightenment, that they see things in a way that other people can't see. They might take on big new projects or big ideas. They might start a risky business venture, or start writing a book, or start doing a project or something like that. Maybe start a relationship that's a bad idea. And but they believe that they have all this power to sort of manage things that may normally seem like a bad idea.
But that's also associated with staying awake late into the night. You said that sleepless night.
That's right. So one of the key features of mania is a symptom that we refer to as decreased need for sleep. So when people are in this heightened energetic state, they might go for 2, 3, 4 nights in a row with minimal or no sleep at all. They might have 2 or 3 hours of sleep on some nights, but they wake right up and they feel completely energized and still feel like they don't have any deficit in terms of their energy. And decreased need for sleep is a little bit different from insomnia. When I'm interviewing a patient and I ask, like, how is your sleep at night? Do you sleep? And they say, no, I'm in bed tossing and turning, worried about my day, and I wake up every 30 minutes. And that's not decreased need for sleep. Decreased need for sleep is I spent all night painting my bedroom orange and calling my congressman to tell him about this new plan I have for Middle Eastern peace or something like that. It's exaggerated, it's energized, it's motivated, it's all these things where trying to get to sleep is not the goal.
So it's not that all medical residents have in mania.
No. You can be not sleeping and not have mania. I mean, decreased need for sleep is a different kind
But it has to come with this excessive energy to really do something much more than your physical, emotional, and intellectual capacity can let you do.
That's right. That's right. And people who are experiencing mania are almost indistinguishable from people who are using psychostimulant drugs like cocaine or methamphetamine. They have the same kind of presentation: rapid speech, elevated mood, agitation, these kinds of things. But then people with bipolar disorder will crash out of that state at some point, and their mood will flip into a depressive phase where they become, they lose interest in activities, they want to sleep all the time, they may lose their appetite. And at this point, the sleep phenotype is really interesting again too, because now they might go into a state of hypersomnia, where they're sleeping much longer than they intended to, and have other kinds of sleep disruption, like more time spent in REM sleep and these kinds of things that are differences in their sleep architecture that seem to be associated with the depressive phase of bipolar disorder.
So you often see this association between sleep disturbances and mania or depression.
That's right. In fact, one of the characteristics of bipolar disorder is that people often have these symptom-free periods that we call euthymic periods, or periods where they're more or less stable. And one of the cardinal symptoms that is an early predictor of a relapse into a new mood episode are these changes in sleep. So it can be, and it can go either direction. Sometimes people might sleep more or they might sleep less, but this is often sometimes the first thing to give us a hint as clinicians that somebody is entering a high-risk period in their treatment.
Oh, I see. So it always comes the question, what is the cause and effect? Or is it always associated with the sleep disturbances? They're as you explained, there are good features. They're kind of closely associated with mania and depression. But there are also sleep disturbances in other psychiatric conditions.
The simple answer is yes.
Okay.
And I'll elaborate, but nearly every psychiatric condition has some kind of sleep disturbance associated with it. But they tend to be a little bit different in how they present. So, for example, a good contrast would be something like post-traumatic stress disorder.
Yeah.
Post-traumatic stress disorder is also characterized by what we call hypervigilance. So this is an elevated state of energy and usually associated with some kind of anxiety or worry.
Yeah.
People with PTSD will sleep very poorly. When they do sleep, they often have nightmares. They may scan their surroundings or look around the perimeters to make sure that there's safety involved.
Yeah.
But they're deeply disturbed by that. They really wish they could sleep.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's a little bit different in terms of the sleep disturbances that you're seeing in bipolar disorder. But schizophrenia has sleep problems. Autism has sleep problems. Many psychiatric disorders have sleep problems.
Yeah, and then the flip side is, does sleep disturbances will increase the risk for some of these psychiatric disorders?
That's a really interesting question, and it seems that they do. So it seems that that having a sleep disorder is one of the well, there's a few different ways you could frame this. And if you're looking at adolescents who haven't yet presented with a first episode psychiatric disorder, so many psychiatric disorders like bipolar disorder or schizophrenia typically present in late adolescence or early adulthood in 18, 20, 25 years old. But many patients who will ultimately develop these psychiatric disorders show early symptoms of something earlier in their development. And sleep disorders is one of the first things that people will see. So unfortunately, it's a non-specific predictor. So if you see a teenager with a sleep disorder, it could mean that they're on their way to becoming a person with schizophrenia or a person with bipolar disorder. But we can't use it as a specific risk predictor. We know that it's an elevated risk, but it's not specific.
But at least if the kids are staying awake all night, then we should discourage them and ask them to take more.
Well, that's absolutely right. So people will suffer low mood or irritability or poor concentration or some of the symptoms of depression just from being sleep deprived.
Yeah. So in that context, then, after people beyond adolescence, when people are getting their first job, and these days a lot of people, they're doing gig works, or their first job may be a shift work, and usually in this shift work environment, whether you're a physician assistant, nurse, or even a delivery guy somewhere, usually those are the entry-level jobs in many cases, where the people are asked to take the night shift or the swing shift or morning shift, where it's an unusual shift and people have to force themselves to stay awake. So there is forced sleep disruption. So then the question is, are shift workers more prone to mood disorders?
Yes, they absolutely are. And this has been really nicely demonstrated by a colleague of mine at the University of Michigan, Srijan Sen, who has done a multi-center study looking at first-year medical interns.
Oh, yes.
And he takes a baseline reading of their mood and their sleep patterns, and then follows them as they go through their medical training. And as a course of their medical training, over the course of their medical training, many of them have to work night shifts and on your very irregular schedules, not necessarily night shifts on a way that's predictable where they can compensate, but erratically. And the rates of depression in this group of shift working medical students goes through the roof. It gets much, much higher at the end of the year than it was before. And it tracks very nicely with the amount of time that their sleep is disrupted.
So even recently, during COVID and post-COVID, a lot of people are reporting that many college students who are not medical students, but college students are also experiencing increased rate of depression. But one thing that also happened during COVID was many students, they transitioned to digital or online learning. And so I have a daughter in college, so I can really relate what is happening. And what I noticed is right now, for many of the class courseworks, not all, the deadline to submit your assignment is midnight.
Yeah.
And so then the kids are staying up. And most kids, these teenagers, they are procrastinating, or they're trying to solve the problem. So they are staying up till midnight just to submit their assignments. And then it's not that right after submitting assignment, they're hitting the bed. That means they have to kind of unwind. And what is becoming very common is a lot of students go to bed after midnight.
Right, right.
To put it mildly. And sometimes it's like 2 or 3.
That's right.
And when we worked with Horacio de la Iglesia, a professor in UW, we both know him. He collects data, sleep data from hundreds of college students from UW, University of Washington. We also saw the same thing. Like a lot of students these days, they are staying up very late into the night. And depending on their class, because sometimes people have class starting from 8 o'clock in the morning, and sometimes they may have late class so they can sleep in. So maybe that might be one reason, because I know that all medical students, you have to actually get up early for the grand round at 7.
That's right. That's right. Well, yeah. So that brings up a really interesting point around how we set up work environments for different kinds of workers. You talked about during COVID how many experienced depression or sleep loss. It turns out it really depends on what kind of job you had. If you were a critical worker who had to still be in, at your job, you were maybe more stressed and more likely to be exposed to the virus and more worried about things and actually had risks for depression that increased. If you were an office worker who could work entirely from home, and now you didn't have to do your 1-hour commute to work in the morning, a lot of people actually made up some of that extra sleep, and actually some people actually gained in their sleep during the COVID pandemic because they weren't commuting. And so I think that really underscores that the work demands have to match the environment. And with the adolescents, like college students or medical students, this, as you know, the circadian clock actually undergoes some really interesting developmental changes through adolescence, where people tend to become more evening in terms of their behavior profiles. We call that the chronotype.
Yeah.
So people switch from kind of a morning type chronotype when they're younger children. We all know the children who wake up at 6 o'clock in the morning when they're 5 or 6 years old. But then when they're 16 or 17 years old, they're sleeping until noon. That's because the chronotype shifts towards eveningness as you go into adolescence. And it may be that certain kinds of environments for learning might actually be better for adolescents later at night, as long as they have time to recover in the next morning. But what ends up happening is like what you said, they have an 8 o'clock start time at class in the morning, even though their biological clock is favoring them to stay up much later. And so that's what we call social jet lag, where people are having to wake up 2 or 3 hours earlier than their natural clocks would prefer them to. And that's a very stressful kind of environment to be in. People like Frank Shear at Harvard have shown that actually causes increases in galvanic skin response. It causes heart rate variability to be off, cortisol responses to be up. So these are very stressful kinds of changes that the body goes through, and it has to be forced to wake up too early.
Yeah. And then another thing that most people can relate to is, irrespective of work environment, people in higher latitudes. In wintertime, there is less light. They're exposed to very little daylight. Of course, the daylight is there, but it's too cold to go outside.
That's right.
And so that's seasonal affective disorders, or SAD. So that's also another point about not only your internal circadian clock, light can also affect, or the lack of light can also affect mood disorders.
Right. The availability of light seems to be the key function there. A lot of people have this idea that seasonal affective disorder is related primarily to cold temperatures. But it's actually the length of the day that seems to be the most important factor for determining that.
But in a few years ago, I was wearing an active watch, and I was monitoring how much light I'm getting in San Diego, and it made me sad, because what I realized was the only time I was getting light, even working in Salk Institute, was when I was driving from home to work or work to home. That's the
Yeah.
time
Yeah.
when I'm exposed to at least some light through the car window. And once I was at work, my regular office is actually in the basement,
Mm-hmm.
2 floors down, next to Rusty Gage's office. And I had the fabulous view of a concrete wall.
That's
So I was getting very little light. And actually, I was not even getting 1 hour of daylight. Not actually in the sun, but even diffuse light, more than 1,000 lux, I was not getting that. So that's also another interesting thing that many students in San Diego, we did this study. We actually put the watch on many 100 students, and we found similar. It's not that severe in UCSD because students actually walk from their dorm to classroom and vice versa. But still, what we found was only when they were walking outdoor,
Yeah.
they were getting some light. And what happens in northern latitude? Means I spent one one winter, that's 9 months in Winnipeg. It's very cold. And in Winnipeg, you don't go from one classroom to another classroom above ground. There are tunnels.
That's right.
You go through the tunnel.
I had the same in Ohio.
Yeah. So now you know that even in winter, although there is daylight outdoor, it's too cold to go outside. So
Yeah.
that can trigger seasonal affective disorders. So,
Well, and to make the point even more forcefully, in our psychiatric unit at the hospital where I work, there are really no windows in any of the rooms, and so we're taking people who are admitted for depression that's so bad that they can't safely be out in society, and yet we're putting them in a place where it's dark and depleted of any kind of light. So at UCSD right now, we're about to open a new psychiatric hospital.
Oh.
And I'm really excited about this opportunity to see if we can use this change to modernize some of the lighting systems and put in full spectrum light that's tunable over the course of the day to change the kind of spectrum that people are getting so that some of our depressed patients can get this kind of stimulating light, especially early in the morning when it's most beneficial for their...
But there's something very simple in that design, like what kind of light you are thinking of putting in this psychiatric.
Well, it turns out that light in the blue and green spectrum is best is the most effective at stimulating the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and or I should say it's most effective at stimulating the retinal cells that go into the brain to not just the suprachiasmatic nucleus, but other parts of the brain that are involved in regulating mood and reward pathways. So having a full spectrum light that includes blue and green in the composition is more effective at lifting mood than a light that's sometimes depleted in that. Like a red spectrum light wouldn't be very good at stimulating those kinds of things.
No, actually, I'm now experimenting with different types of light bulbs at home, and after a very long time, I actually went seriously looked for light bulbs, and I was surprised that there are some really good full spectrum light or some light that where you can change the spectral quality from your smartphone, and I'm kind of experimenting, and those are really fun. And at the same time, they may be a little bit expensive, but at the same, but I think it's worth it even at home because
it probably is, yeah.
Yeah.
And that ability to tune is really important because that same light in the blue-green spectrum in the morning that's beneficial can actually be detrimental in the evening. If you're reading after dinner with your lights on, that kind of light will stimulate you to stay awake too late and
yeah. No, actually, this new light bulbs that I have now, they're connected to my Wi-Fi, and then from my phone, I programmed what is the ramp up time, and how long that they should stay in
that's
blue, green.
Are you tracking your sleep with your watch too to see how you're sleeping?
Yeah. I guess I should track my mood.
Well, these are the kinds of things I would really like to do in our hospital to see if we can, we're collecting mood responses from people in the hospital when they're there anyway, and we could change the lights to do things that we think would benefit mood, and then capture that and see if there's an optimal schedule for light. Nobody really knows at this point what's the best way to illuminate a hospital for depression.
No, that'll be really exciting because once you figure out in a hospital setting where You're actually collecting objective data from patients. You'll be evaluating them periodically, and then you can connect whether a certain lighting schedule is improving their mood. And once you do that, the next step I would expect UCSD would do is to deploy that in all the undergraduate housing. Because there are now almost 10,000 students or so. They are staying in UC housing system.
That's right. And they're building a lot more.
They're building
a lot of it is going up right now.
So this is something that we have to seriously think about, because undergrads are at a very high risk for depression and mood disorders. And then if your research into how spectral quality affects severely, seriously depressed patients, or patients with very serious psychiatric conditions, if this lighting changes, even it nudges the needle slightly among seriously depressed patients, that can be adapted into undergraduate housing lighting. Yeah.
We should think about it in workplaces as well, too.
Yeah. I know that many years ago, there was someone who works for a lighting company. I forget the lighting company. So they got the contract to change or adopt the circadian lighting system in the International Space Station. So
how cool.
I think that's the most expensive work environment, very risky work environment.
I would say so. The dollars per square foot must be really high.
Yeah. So beyond lighting, so now what we are discussing essentially is almost all psychiatric conditions are associated with sleep and circadian rhythm disruption. And sleep and circadian rhythm disruption can increase the risk. It's not that it will simply increase the risk, to be very clear, because all of us will go through some kind of sleep and circadian rhythm disruption at one point. For example, you successfully finished your medical training and you are not, I've never seen you depressed. So. But at least this is a risk factor. But then the next question is, well, there are many medications that are used for successful treatment of many, if not all, patients with depression or psychiatric conditions. Do we know whether some of those medications, first thing, whether they at least partly work through the circadian system? Are they fixing the circadian system or working through the clock? And second, we know that many medications, if given at the right time, they're more effective than at the wrong time. So can you talk about these two?
Sure.
Whether the medications work through clock.
Yeah. Well, let me start by saying that this is not the primary mechanism that most people think that these drugs work. And many of the drugs that we use in psychiatry have very complex mechanisms where they're working on many things at one time. So I don't want to sound like I'm saying only the circadian mechanism is the
Yeah, of course, because for many drugs, many famous drugs, for example, metformin, there are so many different ways they work.
That's right.
We cannot isolate. It's very difficult to isolate at least one mechanism.
Yeah, but let me highlight two different ones that I think are interesting to people. So in bipolar disorder, which is kind of the psychiatric disorder that I have studied the most kind of standard mood stabilizer treatment for bipolar disorder is lithium. Lithium has been around for more than 50 years. It's a very commonly well-studied medication now. And lithium has a number of different effects. It's thought that it might protect neurons from stress, or it might promote the birth of new neurons as they're developing in the human brain. But it also has some circadian rhythm effects. And this is something that we've done in my lab. We can put lithium onto cells, and we can see that the circadian rhythm in the cells actually gets stronger. The amplitude gets higher. And so what that means is that rhythm is going to be harder to disrupt and more durable to external kind of factors that might shift that rhythm out of phase. And so we actually think that lithium does have a circadian mechanism, that we think that lithium strengthens the circadian clock, and that maybe one of the reasons that it's effective for mania is if there's circadian rhythm disruption that's leading to things like this decreased need for sleep that I spoke about. By strengthening the amplitude of the circadian rhythms in the brain, that you can maybe reorient those neurons to be back on cycle with the light-dark cycle in the world, and that stabilizing the circadian clock could be one important mechanism how lithium works.
So one thing that you pointed out that you mentioned in passing, although I understand being in circadian rhythm, is the clock in cells in culture. So you're actually not putting lithium on a patient and then taking out their brain cells and looking at it. So can you tell, like, what is the experiment? How?
Sure. Well, my lab specializes in studying circadian rhythms in cells of many different kinds. The most simple experiment that we can do are we can just take cells that are grown. We call them immortalized cells. These are cells that just grow perpetually in a dish, and we can use a special, we call it a reporter gene, where we take one of the circadian clock genes and link it to an enzyme called luciferase. And so luciferase is the enzyme that causes fireflies to glow in the dark.
Yeah.
And when you package this luciferase gene onto the circadian promoter, what that means is that you can actually make a piece of DNA that will cause a cell to glow on and off with the circadian rhythm that corresponds to that particular cell. And then you can grow those cells under a detector that counts the amount of
camera.
A fancy camera or a detector that measures the amount of light coming off the cell. And you can measure that light emissions over several days at a time. And as the light emissions vary, you can see a nice 24-hour cycle to the pattern that corresponds to the biological rhythm of the cells. And so the next level of kind of sophistication of this experiment is to not just take an immortalized cell, but to take a cell from a patient. So we can take cells from a patient with bipolar disorder, for example. And because
so these cells are, you're not doing any biopsy or anything, but from the skin?
Well,
hair?
we start usually with a skin biopsy.
Okay.
We take a little piece of skin that's about the size of the tip of a pencil.
Oh.
And we use some enzymes to clear away the connective tissue and the blood vessels and isolate the skin cells. And the skin cells have all of the genes that are necessary to run a circadian rhythm.
Oh.
Similar to what you see in the brain. And so this is a really unique system for studying a psychiatric disorder because you don't need access to a neuron to be able to study this behavior. You can study the genetic circuit in an easily accessible tissue like the skin.
But this is exciting because, we always, of course, psychiatric disorders come from problems with our brain, how it processes information or reacts to information. But if there is a common link between sleep and circadian rhythm and psychiatric disorders, then now what you're saying is instead of looking at the brain, how the sleep and circadian rhythm may be altered in the brain, you can actually take the skin, and that is a game changer because you don't have to actually look inside the brain. You can scratch the skin.
That's right.
Take it. This is really game changing. So now you're saying that in this experiment, lithium can increase the amplitude, means going up and down. These cells brighten up too much and then come down, and then become too bright and then go down.
Yeah, that's right. So lithium in these experiments will actually increase the amplitude of the circadian rhythm that we're measuring through this light expression coming off the cells. Interestingly, though, it seems to be different in healthy people and bipolar disorder. So we actually see that the people who are benefiting the most in the terms of their amplitude increase are the healthy people, and there seems to be some impairment in that signal in the people with bipolar disorder. So that's kind of, even though lithium is a therapeutic intervention for bipolar disorder, it seems to be unmasking some kind of problem with amplitude in the rhythm in the patients who have this disease.
So then we also know that some people respond to lithium and some don't. Do you also see the effect of lithium on their skin cells, skin circadian clock?
We see differences in the circadian rhythm between lithium responders and non-responders. So just to give a little bit of background on this, when we give lithium to people with bipolar disorder, roughly a third of them have what we would call a really satisfying response. So they get better, their symptoms go into remission, and they can continue on their way, leading a more or less standard, healthy life. But about another third are what we call lithium non-responders, where no matter how much lithium we give them and how long they stay on the medication, it just doesn't seem to make any difference. And there's another third in the middle who are sort of partial.
Yeah.
And these lithium non-responders tend to be people who have a later chronotype. So they tend to be evening people.
Yeah.
They tend to be ones who have a hard time, more sleep disruption. They tend to be more likely to have suicidal attempts. They tend to spend a lot of their time with other kinds of sleep complaints. And when we take the skin cells from these lithium non-responders, what we find is their circadian rhythm is a little bit longer than a 24-hour cycle.
Huh.
It's more like 25 or 26 hours. It doesn't seem to be, it seems that this delay that we see in behavior is related to a similar kind of delay that we're seeing at the cellular level in terms of the gene expression cycle.
Yeah.
And lithium has a characteristic effect. I talked about the amplitude effect, but what it also does is it actually slows the cycle down a little bit.
I see.
So in a healthy person, your period will go from 24 hours to maybe 25 hours or 24 and a half hours. It's about a 30-minute difference. But in somebody whose rhythm is already running too slow, that effect of lithium further slowing it down seems to be detrimental rather than helpful. And so we think that there's something about this. It's not really the effect of lithium itself that's on the, it seems to be let me back up on this. It's the circadian rhythm that the person brings to the medication that they already had before they started the medication that seems to be determining whether the medication is going to be helpful for them or not. It's not so much the drug effect.
So that's really interesting, because what you're saying is even before you prescribe lithium, in an ideal world, what you can do is you can take a little bit of skin biopsy, or even I've seen also people do hair follicle. You just pull some hairs and then express or put this magic circadian clock reporter that will make the cell glow. And then maybe in a week or so, can you predict whether this person will respond to lithium or not? Theoretically, I'm not saying that it's possible now, but is it possible?
So theoretically, it may be possible.
Yeah.
I think I have a ton of caveats that I would have to give. But the theory is sound, that there may be at least something that you could put into maybe a multivariate model that would be one factor among others that would tell you whether the circadian rhythm could be a predictor of lithium response.
Yeah, because this brings up what we call personalized medicine. Because what you're essentially doing is you're actually measuring one aspect of this person's genetic makeup or whatever that is causing this clock to run slow. And then based on that, you may be making a decision, not now, as you said. It can be one of the factors in making a decision whether lithium is the best medication or not. So this is kind of personalized medicine in psychiatry based on a very simple, seemingly simple, because for us, circadian rhythm, it's seemingly simple. But then, so this is feasible. So now the question is, are there other tests that typically people do for cancer, polygenic risk score, to look at which mutations are there, and then they decide which cancer drugs to give? So has the field come to that point in psychiatry? Because I have seen you publishing with other groups looking at how different genes or mutations affect.
That's right. So maybe before I answer the genetic part, I'll explain why the genetic part may be a better approach than a cell-based experiment. So you said a week after you take the biopsy. A week would be a very optimistic estimate on how long it would take to get a full answer from the kinds of work where the reality is that even though the skin biopsy is giving us really meaningful information, it takes so long to process the samples, grow the cells, and do the experiments, that by the time you did that, you would probably already have your answer from just giving the person the medication. And so where a genetic test may be advantageous is you may be able to get just a signature from somebody's DNA about what the circadian rhythm is going to look like. You may find a series of variants that if they appear in the same combination or the same pattern,
Yeah.
that pattern may indicate what is going to happen in the cell experiment eventually when you do it. And I think that kind of approach may be faster than trying to do a lithium test, because you can get the result back in the same day if you do a genetic test.
Yeah.
And so this is what is already happening for antidepressant response.
Yeah.
So SSRI medications like Lexapro or Prozac or these kinds of things also may have a circadian basis as well. So people like Sean Kane in Australia are showing that SSRI drugs seem to affect the sensitivity of light, of the retina to light, and that by making the eyes more sensitive to light, that maybe people are becoming more beneficial from in ambient light exposure. So you could do some sort of genetic test around light sensitivity. People are already doing kind of more basic genetic tests around things like the enzymes that metabolize antidepressant drugs, like the hepatic CYP450 enzymes, CYP2D6 and CYP2C19, that determine how much drug is going to be available in the body after you take an antidepressant medication. But the future iterations of these tests are going to be using even more information. Like you mentioned polygenic risk scoring, where you're measuring DNA at many, many different genes and aggregating those results to give you a big signal to determine if you aggregate the information from many genes, does it give you more explanatory power to predict an antidepressant response? And those kinds of things are still experimental, but looking very favorable in terms of how they might go.
Yeah, because the cost of genetic testing is going down. So, and also it's possible that in few years, almost every child born will have their DNA sequenced or genotyped at millions of loci or millions of places. So
That's right.
I guess in future, maybe when a patient comes in, you can even, before you see the patient, you may actually have the polygenic risk score.
That's right. This is already happening at Rady Children's Hospital here in San Diego. When children are presenting with clear developmental abnormalities or cognitive delay or these kinds of things, they're getting a whole genome sequencing done. So this is it's not everybody yet, but the technology and the proof of principle is already there that we can do genome sequencing for children. And once the analysis pipelines become developed enough, we can really be able to extract a lot of information from this.
Yeah, even right now, there are now companies which actually somebody pointed out that there are companies which are now offering to get your genome sequenced for less than $1,000. Okay, so how does $1,000 look like in raising a child? So now 1 month cost of childcare
That's right.
in San Diego is at least $2,000. That's right. So,
Right. So the genome cost is minimal compared to
daycare cost for 1 month.
I think the expense that a lot of people don't adequately think about is the genome sequencing just gives you a bunch of T's and C's and G's, right? I mean, it doesn't tell you much about what the actual sequence means. And so I think the interpretation of that and the long-term management of that, it's terabytes of data that is going to be associated with that person's medical record for the rest of their life. And so there's still a lot of interesting issues around how we interpret these things and how we integrate them into existing medical records.
Yeah. No, I guess the point, so you brought up the right point that it's not the cost alone, but the risk of having your DNA data. And also, 20 years ago, if somebody had sequenced their DNA, then we won't be knowing so much about what genetic predisposition this person has to X, Y, Z disease. But with the advancement in science, now we know that we at least there are many genetic centers and many groups working on human genetics. They can predict what the person is likely to have, and that can have a major problem because, for example, I'm not sure whether it's true or not. In VA system, it seems that VA can approve or deny somebody's treatment for certain types of cancers based on that genetic predisposition. I'm not sure about that.
I'm not sure about the that part of the screening process or treatment algorithm at the VA.
Yeah.
I can say that the VA is right at the forefront
Yeah.
in terms of integrating genetics
that's good
into
to know.
research.
Yeah.
They have a really successful program called the Million Veteran Program.
Yeah.
That is they're literally up to 1 million people now, and they can integrate that genetic data with the service history and the medical records of those veterans. So they can take somebody with a psychiatric disorder, for example, and find
PTSD, for example.
say all of the veterans with PTSD in the whole VA system.
Yeah.
And look at the overlap of people who have participated in the Million Veteran Study. And it's tens of thousands of veterans with PTSD now have been sequenced for their genomes. And we can do really powerful kinds of work now on the genetic basis for things like PTSD or schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, these kinds of diseases.
Yeah. And the other thing that I was thinking, because we brought up PTSD and VA, Gulf War syndrome, which is very similar to what in general public we call maybe chronic fatigue syndrome. It's a very similar. People feel really tired all the time. Do you consider chronic fatigue syndrome as a psychiatric disorder, or it's on the borderline?
That's a very controversial topic.
Yeah.
As a psychiatrist, I have a very expansive view of what counts as a psychiatric disorder. So, so perhaps I might say that chronic fatigue syndrome has some psychiatric components to it.
Yeah.
But I don't want to trivialize that and make it sound like these are people who are not experiencing a real disorder or who have it's all in your head is kind of the
No, it's not in the head. What I meant to say was this is definitely a problem because people who have chronic fatigue syndrome or Gulf War syndrome, that the presence of that syndrome is not allowing them to achieve their peak performance.
That's right.
That way, it's definitely it's some condition that's impairing them to thrive well.
That's right. So the way that I would maybe, if we zoom out
Yeah.
and think of how I conceptualize psychiatric disorders, I think of these as some kind of adverse interaction with the environment that puts the brain out of homeostasis and causes impact on emotional processing or cognitive processing or something like that. And so for PTSD, that may be a military veteran who experienced a trauma in a war.
Yeah.
For somebody with chronic fatigue syndrome, that may be an encounter with a virus that disrupted their immune system and caused some kind of inflammatory response.
Yeah.
And so in that way, those kinds of interactions on the brain kind of have some parallels. But the brain function is really what is the common factor there. And so chronic fatigue syndrome probably has other things that are non-psychiatric, like digestive problems or these kinds of things as well too. But it certainly has a psychiatric component.
Yeah. So then the other question that we kind of I'd asked you, but we didn't have time to discuss, is whether there is timing of medication for psychiatric condition. Is there any research on what time certain medications may be more effective or less effective? Because the other side is some medications for psychiatric conditions also make people sleep more or sleep less. Some medications can cause weight gain. So any thought on timing?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, we thought a long time to look at this in terms of lithium, since we think lithium has an effect on the circadian clock, might it matter when you take your lithium? And I've decided that it probably doesn't matter so much for lithium because we are dosing lithium to a steady state level where it's at more or less the same concentration in your body all day long. But I think there are other drugs where perhaps it is more important. So for patients who don't do well on lithium, as psychiatrists, we commonly prescribe antipsychotic medications. So these are medications like risperidone is a good example, that block the dopamine receptor in brain. And these medications sometimes have a shorter half-life and are not necessarily dosed at a steady state level where they're at consistent doses all day long. And we've done some work looking at the weight gain side effects from risperidone and found that you can really change the metabolic consequences of taking risperidone depending on when you take the drug. So we did our first study in mice, and so mice have a flipped sleep-wake cycle, so it's a little bit different from what you would see in a person. But if you give a mouse risperidone right before the mouse is about to have its active phase, the mouse doesn't gain any kind of weight whatsoever. But if you give the risperidone right before the mouse goes to sleep, the mouse puts on weight and starts to show blood sugar abnormalities that look like type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
And we actually looked in our medication records at the hospital where I work to see if we could pull this out of human patients as well too, and sure enough we did. So people who are taking risperidone right before bed seem to show greater weight gain and greater changes in blood sugar compared to people who are taking the risperidone in the morning.
Yeah, but at the same time, I just want to make the disclaimer because you are not making medical recommendations.
That's right. I'm not necessarily advocating medical advice or telling people to change the time that they're taking their medication without consulting with their doctor.
Yeah.
And there are sometimes reasons that we have to time medications at certain times of the day. You mentioned side effects.
Yeah.
Some medications are very sedating, and even if there are some advantages to taking it in the morning, you might not practically want to do that because you would be too drowsy to be able to tolerate the medication.
To drive, and also if you're
go to work or
go to
take care of children or these kinds of things.
Yeah. And also there can be contraindication, interaction between drugs. If they're taking some other drugs that can affect.
That's right, and some interact with meal timing as well too.
Yeah,
so some medications have to be taken on an empty stomach or a full stomach and these kinds of things.
Yeah, but at least there is some mouse experiment and also retrospective observation in your medical records, showing that there is some effect of timing of these medications. Some medication, not lithium, because lithium will stay at very high level or steady state level.
Steady state levels.
Yeah. There are other things that people can do. Like, for example, I work on time-restricted feeding. We have seen that, at least in mouse experiment, time-restricted feeding can reduce the effect of obesogenic diet.
Yeah.
So have you seen anything like that, at least in mouse model of treatment for psychiatric disease, and combining that with specific diet type or timing?
So we haven't really talked much about the neuron work that I'm doing.
Yeah. So let's go back.
So let me answer that question in a kind of a long way, which is that in addition to doing skin cells, we've done other experiments where you can use special molecular biology techniques to turn the skin cells into stem cells, which these are cells that can turn into any kind of cell in the body.
Yeah.
And we've turned those stem cells into neurons and done the same experiments using circadian rhythm reporters in neurons from lithium responders and lithium non-responders. And we saw similar effects to what we saw in the skin cells when we did the neurons. But one of the additional things that we saw is that the rhythm was very, very weak in the lithium non-responders compared to the responders. But we were able to rescue the rhythm by putting those neurons onto an external temperature cycle. So if we just changed the temperature, even just by 2 degrees in our incubator every 12 hours or so, the rhythm would start to wake back up again in these neurons. And so that taught us some really important things, that these neurons don't have any photoreceptors that are picking up light. So there are other pathways that you can get into the circadian clock that may include other things like temperature, or we can do this also with changing the nutrient composition in the media that we grow our cells. And so that says that maybe diet could be an important way to provide an accessory pathway to your brain to stimulate a circadian rhythm, even if the light pathway is not working for some reason. And so I know that your colleague, Emily Manouchian, is working on a study to look at time-restricted feeding in bipolar disorder to see if you can guide the circadian clock by providing food at the right time of day. And as far as I know, that study hasn't started yet, but we're all waiting very excitedly to see what the results of that study are going to look like.
So going back to this exciting work you're doing to create neurons from bipolar disease and also from normal people, and then studying that. That's really exciting because you can model a depressed neuron, a normal neuron, and the disc.
That's right. We don't talk about it as depressed neurons and happy neurons and that sort of thing, because it's very difficult. One of the challenges to making a cellular model of a psychiatric disorder is what do you measure
Yeah.
to know if there's a difference between this neuron and that neuron in the two groups. And actually, I did some work with your neighbor, Fred Gage,
Yes.
back in 2015. The first paper that we did in bipolar disorder was done in his lab, where they did electrophysiological recordings from neurons from patients with bipolar disorder and found that those neurons had what we call the hyperexcitability phenotype. So the action potentials that those neurons use to generate electrical activity are faster in the bipolar neuron than they are in the control neuron.
Wow.
And when we put lithium on the neurons, we found some really remarkable differences. We found that lithium could normalize the firing rate in neurons that came from a responsive patient, but in neurons that came from a non-responsive patient, the lithium had no effect on that electrophysiological readout.
Property. Yeah.
And so that was really exciting that you could use electrophysiology as a marker for disease, as a disease marker. But the problem with that is it doesn't correlate very well to a behavioral phenotype that you can kind of track over different levels of analysis. Or maybe it does, but we haven't found what that behavioral phenotype is yet. So when we did the circadian rhythms experiments, we thought that that was really exciting because you can track a circadian rhythm in a cell all the way through a circuit in the brain and then into behavior into a human. And there's some continuity of the experimental model there. And so
no, that's actually your work with Rusty. We call him Rusty Gaze, Fred Gaze. Actually inspired us to take it one step further to see whether we can get suprachiasmatic nucleus neurons from skin cells. And that paper was actually published maybe a couple of weeks ago.
So, congratulations. I know that you've been working on that for a long time.
That paper took a long time to do because we have to, it was a complicated process to figure out which factors are necessary to first make the skin cell become a neuron and also skin cell to become a suprachiasmatic nucleus neuron that can produce the markers like the neuroendocrine or the peptides or the hormones that the SCN neurons produce. I cannot say that we made SCN neurons because, there are 2 or 3 major types of SCN neurons.
Right.
At least we made one type of SCN neuron. So then the question is, just like you said, that our behavior comes from interaction among many different types of neurons. So if we can come up with making different types of neurons from the skin cell and putting them together, just like Rusty is making mini brains or brain organoids where there are many different types of neurons working together, then maybe we can take it even one step further to ask whether we are making happy brain or...
Yeah, that's right. Well, that brings up another challenge to this kind of work is the neuronal model that you pick for a psychiatric disorder is going to be different depending on what the question is. And so for a question about what is the marker for lithium response, maybe one kind of model versus something about neuronal development may be a completely different kind of model, or something about inflammation may have a different kind of model. So picking the right kind of cell can be sometimes a challenge, or the right model can be a challenge, especially if you don't know what the readout is supposed to be.
Yeah, so and then I know that you are working recently on ketamine, but I don't know whether we have enough time, or maybe we can. Can you tell a little bit about what you are working on?
Yeah, sure. So this is something that I'm doing mostly in the clinical setting at this point. I haven't done a lot of research on this, but ketamine is an anesthetic medication that's been around since the 1950s. And but about 10 years ago, some researchers, John Crystal and his team at Yale, identified that a single dose of ketamine at low doses, that's not enough to actually anesthetize somebody, but just to give them kind of a mild dissociative sensation, had very rapid antidepressant effects. And so people were getting better from their depression within just a few hours. And that effect would last for a few days before slowly relapsing back into a depressive phase. And so for the past 10 years, people have really been furiously studying this medication to see if there's ways that you can give the drug either repeatedly or through different kinds of dosing patterns that will make the effects more sustained and more durable. And at the VA San Diego, where I work, we have a treatment refractory depression center that is using ketamine for veterans who have failed multiple standard antidepressant trials, and and we use ketamine to treat those people. And we find that if we give it repeatedly over the course of several months, that we can get some enduring benefits, and people can sometimes go into a full remission from their depression.
Yeah. But are there people who are resistant to ketamine? Have you?
Unfortunately, there are, yes.
Oh, I see.
The story is kind of similar to what we see with lithium. And so it roughly breaks down by thirds. We see about a third of people who, with ketamine treatment, can go into what we call a remission, where their symptoms are basically gone.
Yeah.
We see another third of people who, if we give ketamine and then some additional things like psychotherapy and kind of cognitive skills training and things like that, can go into some kind of maintenance treatment, but they might still need to stay on ketamine for longer periods of time.
Yeah.
And then a last group of people who even everything we do doesn't seem to really help, and they might need still something else beyond ketamine.
Yeah. So you haven't tested whether ketamine is affecting the clock.
We have looked at that. So there is clinical data from NIMH, from Carlos Urate's group, and he found that the sleep patterns and circadian disruption did seem to predict who was going to be a circadian responder a ketamine responder or non-responder. So there's, at the clinical level, there is some indication that circadian rhythms may be important. And another researcher, Biff Bunny at UC Irvine, has done some really interesting work looking at the changes in the brain that ketamine cause seem to overlap with some of the gene expression changes that you see from other kinds of antidepressant interventions. So they're suggesting that there's some common neuronal mechanisms there between ketamine and antidepressant and circadian clock. We have done some preliminary experiments in our lab and haven't really generated anything conclusive yet that I want to say on camera, because we're still working on it. We haven't been able to crack the code on how to get that to show up in a cellular model yet.
Yeah, I mean, there are many challenges. How much ketamine you are actually adding, how much is there, how much the cells are seeing, and
that's right.
We see that complexity, and you have to work through all these steps to make sure. And then whether it's reproducible. As a scientist, we have to do it again and again. Yeah. So it takes time. But
ketamine probably is involving complex circuits that are going beyond what you can see in a single cell. So, I mean, you're seeing this in some of the functional MRI data that you're seeing that it's loosening connections between different parts of the brain and kind of opening the brain up to new kinds of experiences by loosening up some of the connections. It may not be something you can see in a single cell because you need that network effect.
So now we actually went through many different topics from sleep to ketamine. To bring it back, there are a few things that people always ask. Well, one thing people ask is, well, if sleep disruption or insufficient sleep can increase my risk for X, Y, Z, and I'm partially insomniac or I cannot sleep well, can I take melatonin and sleep well or reduce my risk? What is your take on melatonin to reduce the risk or to get some sleep?
You're asking me
nothing to do with psychiatric condition.
Okay.
Just simple.
So this is another controversial topic. People have a lot of opinions about melatonin. I think that the data are pretty clear if you look at meta-analyses that melatonin does have a sleep-inducing effect. But it seems to be at the higher doses, sort of maybe 5 milligrams and higher, it causes some kind of sedation. And it predominantly at the beginning, early phase of the night. So it induces some kind of, reduces the time that it takes to fall asleep. I think the data are more equivocal about whether it keeps you asleep longer through the night or prolongs your total sleep quality.
And also you're talking about the data that comes from like really pure melatonin, because in market, you see a lot of melatonin pills, but then since these are over the counter, not regulated by FDA, we often don't know.
That's right. There's a lot of variability.
But you are talking about really good, high standard data, clinical studies.
That's right. Using kind of
more rigorous,
high quality, procured. The part that is maybe more controversial is that dose of melatonin is giving you a blood level that's many times higher than the physiological amount of melatonin that your body is making. And the typical dose that you would need to kind of induce a circadian effect where you're actually shifting the phase of your circadian clock is much, much lower.
Yeah.
And is typically given early in the night rather than right before bedtime.
Yeah.
And so I've tried to explain this to my patients, and some of them will get it, but the nuances of having to explain that you should actually decrease your dose to a much lower dose and take it much earlier in the night if you want to sleep properly, it's very difficult to explain that to a patient. And as a practical matter, I don't try to take that approach very often because it's the nuances become just too hard to implement clinically.
Yeah. So it's actually a lower dose and at least 2 to 3 hours before bedtime or even more. Right?
That's right. If you wanted to turn an evening person into a morning person or a neutral chronotype, that would be the dosing strategy that you would use.
Yeah.
With maybe in addition to some sort of light interventions like bright light in the morning and low dose melatonin at dusk, something like that.
Dusk, not really at bedtime, just before you're going to bed.
That's right.
Take your melatonin. What are the other things that people can do right now to reduce the risk for psychiatric disease, such as seasonal affective disorders? That's the lowest hanging fruit, I always think, or certain kind of depression even.
So it's really the same pillars of good health that we use for many other kinds of disorders. So sleep, diet, and exercise are all really important. Regular sleep is really important. If people are not sleeping well, there are cognitive behavioral therapy interventions for sleep that are probably more effective than medications that can really help people break out of some of the bad habits around sleep and get more regular sleep. Exercise is a really important way to get rid of stress and maintain good physiological health. It gets you tired at the right time of night so that you can fall asleep more easily, and it gets you outside where you're getting your bright light. So those are good ways of getting. And then of course, diet is very important as well too. A lot of sleep disorders, like for example, obstructive sleep apnea, are linked to being overweight and having poor metabolic health. So improving your diet, improving your exercise, improving your exposure to light, making sure that you're getting light in the morning for at least 20 or 30 minutes a morning. And you were mentioned the indoor light versus outdoor light. Outdoor light is 1,000 times stronger than indoor light. And so the right kind of light in the morning can be very helpful as well too.
Yeah. No, that's wonderful because, sometimes people ask me, and then also another thing is when caregivers, somebody who is taking care of another person who is depressed or is going through an episode, then the question is what that caregiver can do. Or suppose say you have a friend who is going through depression. And my rule of thumb these days is, well, don't show up in the person's house in the evening. At least go take the other person for a walk outdoor.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. There's a whole brand of psychotherapy called social rhythms therapy.
Oh, that's cool.
That uses it's premised on the idea that social contact is a Zeitgeber or a circadian timekeeper as well too. And so that having regular contact with people at work or people in your family at the same time of day is another entrainment signal that you can use. And so having early social contact, if somebody is prone to sleeping late in the morning and can only wake up if they're called by a friend or visited by their spouse or something like that, those can be sometimes very important cues that you can use to trigger your circadian clock to get onto a more normal cycle.
Yeah, so I have seen that in, anecdotally I have heard, and then sometimes, I don't know whether I had read a paper, when people retire from their work, particularly the regular 8 to 5, those who are doing 8 to 5 job, some of them when they retire, if they're evening type, then now they have a lot of time in the morning to sleep in. So they sleep in late into the day, they have no regular social contact, and then they're likely to get into depression because they're not getting morning light, they're kind of staying in the bed, and then in the afternoon when they get up, they actually don't have that workplace social contact because, I always say that we are spending more than half of our wakeful time at work.
That's right.
And most of our social contact are at work. And when you stop that, when you're working, even for some people who are working from home, of course, they have other reasons. They're taking care of the family or something. But in some cases, the older individuals who are retiring and they don't have that social entrainment. So this kind of reminded me.
That's right. Some amount of structure is actually very helpful for mental health. And it's funny, when we talk about, you'll sometimes hear people talking about taking a mental health day.
Yeah.
And when they say a mental health day, what they mean is that they sleep really late,
Yeah.
drink some beer, and then watch a movie all night. And those are exactly the wrong kinds of things to do to promote your mental health. If you're really going to take a mental health day, you should wake up and exercise in the morning and
Or go to the zoo, go to the park,
go socialize with a friend.
hiking.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's really interesting to see that at the end of the day, it's always the three pillars of health: sleep, nutrition, and exercise.
I think that's right.
And exercise outdoor if you can do.
I think that's right. Wearing sunscreen.
Wearing sunscreen, yes. Thank you so much, Mike.
It's really been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I learned a lot, and I hope everybody also learned a little bit that they can adopt, they can use in their own life. Thank you, and we'll talk again in a couple of weeks.